This is the Lekker Rugby Interview.
Ben Herring is a former rugby player turned coach who's coached extensively around the world, including in Japan, where he's worked with Tony Brown and Jamie Joseph. I asked him about Tony Brown, by the way, as a coach later on this video. Make sure you don't miss it. Ben also worked as the head coach for Toyota Blitz under the director of rugby, Steve Hansen. Now, Ben thought it a good idea to start a podcast called Coaching Culture by Ben Herring that dives into the deeper side of coaching, not the technical side, but the more human side. And he started this podcast with a discussion with Eddie Jones, and that's going to be followed with an interview with Steve Hansen and then Johan Ackermann, that we all know in South Africa. Now, this podcast will be carried on our channel as well, so make sure you don't miss it. The first one, the link to Eddie Jones is on the screen up here. The links to the channel is also in the description and in the pinned comment down below. Make sure you go there. Make sure you subscribe to the Coaching Culture podcast by Ben Herring. And without any further ado, let's talk to Ben. Welcome to the Lekker Rugby Pod interview. It's my pleasure to welcome Ben Herring to this channel. And before I go any further, welcome, Ben. And tell us why we're talking to you today.
Thank you, mate. It's a pleasure to be here. Isn't it the joy with the internet that you can connect with people all over the world so easy? Mate, I'm here to talk about a little bit about me and myself and what I get up to, particularly around a podcast on culture, where I'm interviewing international rugby coaches about the cultural side of the game, which is a part of the game which is often talked about, but no one really dives into. And I just think it's so important, and I've got the platform and the means to bring it to people, so I'm intending to do that.
All right, we'll get to that just now. I just want to paint a bit of a picture of who you are as a player and as a coach. You're a New Zealander, you played for Otago, you played overseas, you played with the Leicester Tigers, and I had a bit of a chuckle when you told me about your run-in with Heineke Meyer, for example, at the Leicester Tigers when he was the coach there. Tell us about that a bit.
Yeah, I was a player, I think it was 2010 or 9, or when Heineke first got to the club, and there was a big fanfare about him coming, and he was fantastic. And in the first week, my job in the team was the social guy, so I had to organise all the events, the fun stuff, get the boys together to celebrate things. And I thought, first week, what we'd do is we'd welcome Heineke into the club. And we did that by having a staff 100-metre race where all the staff were handicapped, and the players would all sit back and watch and vote on where everyone would rank in a 100-metre sprint out of the 30-odd staff members. And I think Heineke was maybe he might even had a goal line start. We sort of backed him. We didn't know how fast he would be, so he had maybe a scratch start. But as soon as that gun went, he just went racing, and he must have taken a tumble on about halfway. And we all thought it was hilarious because he got up straight away, kept sprinting, and he took another tumble on about the 22, and then he got up again, sprinted all the way through the line, and collapsed at the end. And we thought it was just awesome. But as it turned out, he'd snapped his Achilles, I think, or whatever it was. But the adrenaline and the passion that he was trying to win that race meant he was on crutches for the whole time that he was there. Had to have a golf buggy and do all his coaching from the golf buggy in the first 6 months. So not an ideal start for him, but we did rally behind the fact that he didn't stay down when he took that hit. He got up and went again.
You actually coached at Leicester Tigers as well, but we'll get to that just now. Just tell us about your playing history a little bit. You played for Otago and the likes. Where did you start? What position did you play?
I used to be a number 7, so I actually played for Southland and then the Highlanders, and then moved to Wellington and played for Hurricanes. Look, and then moved to Leicester and played for Leicester for a number of years. Look, I was a small open side flanker. There's no way in South Africa I would have had a chance. I would have had to put on some serious size. So I think my playing weight in Super Rugby was probably only 95 kilos, dripping wet. Loved the breakdown, loved getting stuck into that zone, and probably as a result, up against two bigger guys, just got knocked out too many times, and that was the end of me at Leicester.
You actually stopped playing because of concussion, which is quite relevant lately, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It wasn't good either, but I had some phenomenal help. My wife, a real academic, and she did some amazing studies. I was the guinea pig for her on how to heal from some pretty serious head knocks with some long-lasting repercussions. She really got to the bottom of them with a lot of food diaries and things like that, and analysing herbs and supplements which complement each other to make a full recovery after about 6 months, which was fantastic.
That's quite interesting. Like I said, it's quite relevant. A lot of rugby players are having to go off for concussion, have court cases going on and everything else. Is that a proven kind of a thing to overcome it, or is it just sort of anecdotal?
Yeah, it's huge. There's a lot of science in behind it, and not all of it's conclusive. However, the biggest thing my wife said about the concussion, which I think it's something which all players should think about with concussion, it's very easy when you get concussed. They'll just say, look, you just need to rest. Where if it was for any other injury, say you get a whack on the leg, you know that you can ice it, you can do all that stuff to help aid that process. And so it is true too that you can do a lot to actually bring down some of the inflammation in your brain that you actually don't think of. Certain herbs, combinations together, actually have really compounding effect on inflammation in the brain, and eating a lot of those, for example. There's also a lot of things which can be quite individualized that if you were to eat, as opposed to me, it might not have any effect on you, but on me, it actually stimulates my brain and keeps my brain from repairing to its optimal level. And I think that kind of philosophy around when you've got a head knock, it's your responsibility, as it's your brain, to actually start thinking about what's triggering you to not heal as quickly as you could do. So for example, in my case, it got to about sort of 5 months, and I still had my brain fog, still had dyslexia, still had mood swings. And my wife just said, you're clearly doing something to not make you heal optimally. Clearly something's keeping you in that state. And so her response, being a very good nutritionist, was, let's food diary everything. And we found I just recorded everything, and then I would record when did my brain go foggy, and then she would come back to me the weeks later and say, here's the link between every time you get that brain fog and that headache, you're eating these nuts. So I reckon we got to go without those for a while, because whilst they're not inherently stimulants for you, they're doing something to you. And I think that's a bit of personal responsibility. If we know rugby, you're going to get a head knock or degrees of it. You just got to be really active around how you as an individual maximize your recovery. It's just too easy to say, oh, I'm just going to rest for 2 weeks and do nothing. But you wouldn't do that with a cork thigh. You would massage, you would ice, you would elevate. You do all of that stuff. But there's this sort of thing around head knocks where you just, I'll do nothing. And I think there's something in that which needs to change our mindset around that concept. And she's got heaps of research to back that up. She was an ex-medical researcher, so she knows how to read medical papers. So I was very privileged to have that sort of access to someone that did so much digging for me and found stuff which really worked for me.
All right, thanks. That's quite interesting and it's quite relevant. I wanted to ask you now, you stopped playing and then you decided to go into coaching. And you started with a high-profile team. Tell me about that.
Yeah, look, I had no intention to coach. I wanted to travel and see the world in a combi van. But Richard Cockrell, who was head coach at the time at Leicester, obviously saw something in me and said, mate, would you like to stay? I'd like you to stay on as a sort of a skills contact defence coach. And I gave it a little bit of thought and just went, you know what, I could give it a crack. And as soon as I did it, man, I loved it. It was just such a rewarding profession. And I loved it so much that I coached Leicester till about from 8 in the morning, or earlier, probably 7 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. And then I went up the road to Nottingham, second division team, to do all the evenings. And then they played on Sundays, so I could do both games on the weekend. I just fell in love with the art of coaching, and that's where my passion lie, about getting the best out of people. And from there, it's just been, the last 16 years has been in pro coaching around the world. And I made a real point not to stay in one place for too long, because I have this belief, and it's not everyone's belief, that I didn't want to ever just get stuck in one way of doing things. I didn't want to just regurgitate a system that someone else had put it in. I wanted to understand how to motivate, how to have empathy, how to get the best out of people, how to grow the culture of a group. And I just thought, for me, the best way to do that is to just throw myself in the most diverse cultures I could get and just sink or swim. And what you learn when you're in those positions where you can't speak the language, got no idea what their backgrounds are or even why they're there. You just have to roll with things and learn on the go, and I enjoy that. I enjoy that sort of change, and it's shaped me immensely as a person and as a coach.
Now, the podcast that you started called Coaching Culture is about the other side of coaching, not just, running drills and making plans and strategy and the likes, the human side almost of it and how to approach that. And we're going to get into that just now. But I'm interested to see what jumped out from what you just said there. It's the fact that you were a player and then you became a coach. There's a lot of debate whether a good coach should have been a good player. And a lot of pundits lately have been ex-players. There's a lot of debate. Does it actually translate going from a player to a pundit or a coach in this matter, in this issue, or is it relevant? Is it required or not really?
Look, there is that debate around does a pro player have the sort of qualifications to coach what they know? And I would say generally most players don't make good coaches. I would say the majority of them, and probably a good reason for that is because often good players don't actually know why they're good. They're sort of like some of the best players in the world I know are just excellent players. They know what they want to do and they just go and do it and they just get better at it. But then when it's not you, when you're having to get it across the line with somebody else to make somebody else understand, that's a whole different thing. I think part of where I coached throughout when I was playing, just because I quite enjoyed the concept, schoolboy stuff, club rugby coaching. I did a lot of it just on the side because I liked helping out. So I always liked it, but I had a different journey in that I didn't make my school first 15s. I didn't make any age group teams. I didn't make a rep team till I was 21. And for me, what that did for me was actually shape a little bit of grit and made me sort of think about how to get better myself. Like I wasn't getting coached because I had none. Wasn't in an academy or anything like that. So I was just working out how to do a weights program, working out how to do skills and drills, and thinking outside the box because I had no reference point. And I think that's, looking back, served me really well, that I actually had to think about what I'm doing and why the whole way through.
Right. Now, we saw a lot of players, people talking about a coach losing the cloakroom or the change room for that matter. What does that mean?
I guess the short of it means is when you lose the trust of the players and probably the respect as well. And once that happens, it's like poison and you're slowly dying as a coach, because every time you get up and speak in front of that group that's been poisoned, then nothing you say really sinks deep. It's all surface level stuff. So if you lose the changing room, you've lost the trust. And once you've lost it, it's actually really hard to get it back. It takes the old adage that it takes a lifetime to build a reputation, but one mistake to tear it down is very true in the coaching scene. And it's just, I think a lot of coaches do get that wrong, and it's probably the stresses and strains of coaching which make them largely act in ways which isn't congruent with who they actually are as a person. I think there's another statement around coaches that they're, generally speaking, coaches are fantastic people, just insert a word here, just a-holes under pressure. And I think that's really true, because if you're not a coach, you probably can't imagine some of the pressures and strains which get to you, which you don't expect. It's when you've got a room full of people, 50 people, eyes on you, and then you're getting judged because the 10 missed the shot at goal to win the game, and all your hours and hours and weeks of work is being scrutinised by people that have no idea what you've actually done. So it's a weird dynamic, and not many professions you get analysed weekly by people that have got no idea about what's actually going on. Not many offices in the world. Joe Bloggs down the road can say, I don't think your accounting sums are very good this week. I think we need to have a little bit of a chat about it like that.
Yeah.
McDonald worker.
But when you get to the players know what it's about. And this is where I'm going towards with this podcast of yours is, why do they lose the trust of the coach? Why does a coach lose the trust of the players? Is it because his plans aren't working, or his defensive system is failing, or whatever it might be? Or is it because of something else, a bit of a softer issue maybe, that's where I'm going to?
Yeah, I think it is the softer issues. There's always a degree of technical knowledge, which, and depending what level you're at, let's say if we're at a professional level, you have to meet a certain threshold of technical ability. And if you're under that, you're going to come under scrutiny for that reason, for sure, because that's what professional players want. They want the coaches that can uplift. But that level isn't probably as high as you might expect at professional level, provided that you're the other side, like you talked about, that softer side, the cultural side, the environmental side of your being is congruent. So what I mean by that is, like, if you're just being you and your interactions are authentically you, and that you're not trying to be someone else, you're just being you. Say, for example, I'm a middle-of-the-road coach and I have a fantastic personality and invite people in, that would get me by in a lot of ways, because players go, look, he's himself, he is what he is, and they can go, yeah, he's just a middle of the road coach, but he's a great guy, he's always himself, and you get the pass, you get that the change room keeps with you, because like you're consistent with yourself. But the moment I then try be something I'm not, and I go, actually, man, and I start like critiquing people and getting really picky with details, and if I'm not that guy, and I never have been that guy, and I'm trying to be that, players can sniff that out instantly. Like their bullshit readers are high. Players know when a coach is standing in front of them not being their authentic self. They just, you know it. You know when someone's faking it. And so there's no point faking it, because it just loses trust. And it's better to just be yourself, regardless of what you think that looks like. And I think the best example of that is when, and I've had this as a player and as a coach, where a player asks a question, and if you don't know it, and you say, it's a great question, I actually don't know that. Oh, let me think about that, I'll get back to you. Now, that's admitting you don't know. And if a player knows that's you, they go, okay, cool, that's all right, I can handle that. But if you were to then make up a reason or pretend that you did know and give some waffly answer, the player then thinks, I don't know about this guy, like, I think he's pulling one over me, like, I think he's being a little bit deceitful here with how much knowledge he has. And that bit is the bit, then from then on, all subsequent conversations are laced with a little bit of that poison, that little bit of like, does he actually know what he's talking about here, even if it is something that he knows about, or she? So I think that concept is a big one for coaches, and it's important for keeping that dressing room.
I'm trying to find out what the balance is, because you talk about the technical side of things, and then you talk about, we call it the softer side or the cultural side of it. And there are certain coaches in South Africa at the moment, very big on the cultural side, beloved by everyone, but the technical side is sort of there's a problem there. And the team was doing well, team did exceptionally well. I'm not naming names here, but it's slipping now. And how far does that softer cultural being in touch with your feelings kind of a coach go when you start losing and the technical side of it is not strong enough?
Yeah, so you've got to have a balance. Firstly, I'll make the reference point around when we talk about the cultural side, when we talk about the softer skills, that's not something to say that it's weak. Like there's this kind of generalistic feeling, particularly from generations gone by, where just because you're in touch with the emotional side of a team, it doesn't mean you're not having the hard conversations. In fact, quite the opposite. You're actually better placed to have hard conversations with players, direct, blunt, smack in the face stuff, if you've gone about getting to know players a little bit behind the scenes. So when we talk about the softer skills lead to being able to have harder conversations. So if I know a player inside out a lot better because I've taken that time to get to know him, connect with him, then I can actually say, I can tell him to pull his finger out better because he has that level of respect and rapport, and it can be done without resentment. So I just wanted to clear that because it's a misconception sometimes around the cultural piece. It's not a weak thing, it's actually a strength. And just wanted to clarify that. I think so. If we know that, then that's the first piece. The second piece is if you're coaching, particularly professionally or anywhere where you've got multiple coaches, I think it's important to note not everyone's natural skill set is that more emotive cultural side. Like some people are technical and tactical, some people are cultural and empathetic and all that stuff, connections. Some people are in the middle, some people are upper quartile on both. Some guys nail that stuff, and the best coaches in the world are probably that. However, that's a small minority. So for the rest of us, I think it's important if you're coaching in combinations like another coach or a group of coaches, is you actually find people that can complement what you offer. So if I'm a strong technical coach and I nail that, but I'm a bit blokey with some of my emotions and whether I'm in touch with that stuff, I'll probably should be looking to get someone to complement that, someone that's got that other side and can connect with some of the players that need that side of things. So the whole concept of coaching as a team is a massive one, and not just getting all the same sort of people, because A, you're just going to do it one way and you're not going to probably have robust discussions around different ways, and B, you're probably not going to maximize the coaching group's reach and impact on the whole team. I've got one more point on that, just while it's at the top of my head, because I sat down with Eddie and he made this point, and I'll use him as a reference because I thought it was really valid. He said because he's gone through a number of teams, he's gone in there and he's assessed what's actually needed for this team. Is it the cultural piece, or is it the technical piece, or is it somewhere along that spectrum? Which I thought was really interesting. And he gave the example for England, and whether you think this is right or wrong, that's what it is. But this is what he went in. He went in and said, England, what they lacked was the way they were going to play. So he said, the guys are professional, they've got a great culture, they come together. He felt that they'd lost their way of playing, their technical and tactical stuff. He said his thoughts were, England are a team which is like a wear them down team, like box kicks, possession, territory, that type of thing. And he felt that they'd lost their DNA around how they play the game, the technical side, around what they do as a team. He was happy with the culture of the group, but they were great fellas, professional, all that stuff. He said, that's not the work I'm focusing on. I'm focusing on the technical and tactical side of things for this group, because our game needs to represent that. He then said when he went to Japan that it was the opposite. He said, skill-wise, the boys are actually really good. What they didn't have was the meaning behind why they played and what they were doing it for. So that's where he said, that's the cultural piece. I need to put my eggs into this basket. And he wanted to play, he was saying, we're playing to save Japanese rugby. That was the theme that he used. So we've got to work harder, faster. And he created that theming because he felt that's the area of that particular team where the emphasis needed, the cultural side and the meaning and the theming behind it. So I think in any team you're with, just understanding where your team is at on a spectrum to how much you apply either of those two things.
Well, it takes a man or a woman to be able to recognize my team needs this. I'm not that good at it, so let me get someone into that. That goes towards how good a coach the guy actually is, analyzing and then recognizing problems or strengths and then acting on it, isn't it?
Yeah, and I guess it goes back to a little bit before, like if you try to do something and try, you have a crack at it for sure, but if you're trying to do it well and it's just not you, you got to do something. And I think you're right. It's a very open-minded person and team-first sort of person that can do that.
And open-mindedness is not necessarily something that you would accuse most top coaches of being open-minded, I suppose. And I'm glad you raised the issue of Eddie. Eddie was your first guest on your podcast, Eddie Jones, let's make no mistake. And we're going to run that podcast on our channel as well, so people can go have a listen to it. I'll put the link up here on the screen so you can go listen to it. You talked about being direct and blunt. I don't think there's anybody that's more direct and blunt than Eddie. And also, I think to a large degree, and I want to ask you this question, pardon me if I'm offending anybody, but the trustworthiness of the guy, accusations of having an interview with Japan while he was at the World Cup with Australia, coming to the Stormers for a week and making promises to players, and then next, lo and behold, he's on the plane to England. We've got a history with the guy. He helped us to win the World Cup in 2007. Him and Jake White are good friends. Is he the right type of coach? What did you think of Eddie Jones as a coach? I'm sorry, I don't want to burn any bridges here. I'm just curious about that aspect of it.
Yeah, it's a fair question, and to be fair, I've had a lot of feedback from a lot of people around the podcast and my thoughts, and for some very high profile people actually wrote to me personally to ask to dig a little bit deeper. And he is a polarizing guy. To be honest, I know Eddie only as in a personal level, going out for coffee with him whilst he's in Japan, and in that regard, I really enjoy my conversations with him. And I take it like this: he's been coaching professionally for almost 3 decades, so he has got experience to burn. And that's what I was looking at the podcast. I was like, whatever your thoughts on Eddie are, and whatever, however he's fired you up, or from whichever country, there's been a few that he's come to, you can't deny that he has experience to boot. And I was intrigued. And one of my questions, for example, was, how do you deal with some of this real public criticism you get and this public scrutiny in the media? Like, most normal people wouldn't be able to fathom that side of things. So part of the podcast creation was to ask guys like Eddie, like those things, like what's it like to be attacked by the media, and whether he deserves it or not is anyone's call. But he had some really good background stories to that, and how he's got his skin weathered and things like that to be able to take it. And that's what I wanted to get out of the conversation. Because when you sit down and talk to him over a coffee or a beer, you won't get a more open, genuine guy that can speak rugby for an hour. He is awesome in that front, and I take my hat off to him. And every time I've sat down for coffees or a beer or a red wine, which is his favourite, I couldn't fault him anymore. I've never been coached by him, but I certainly know coaches that coach with him, and he drives a very hard ship on players and staff, and it's a mixed bag on the reviews from both players and staff. Some people love him, some people hate him, and same with a lot of public. So I'm probably not... I don't know if I can comment on the South African public's outlook, but yeah, I can understand the sentiment.
South Africa is quite easy. If you're with us, you're with us, and if you're against us, we hate you, kind of a thing. So it's just how it works. It doesn't matter who you are. I can say that from personal experience as well. I've personally experienced the wrath of a coach, or the ire of a coach, from who's under pressure. And Eddie said a couple of things there about being under pressure as a coach and having to deal with it. Talk to me about that a bit.
Yeah. He does feel the weight. Like, he's a workaholic. And so he puts more time. I don't know this for a fact. He probably works harder than any other coach. He gets up, he hardly sleeps. And I'm good friends with a couple of translators in Japan who have to go to bed at 12 o'clock, wake up at 2 o'clock and translating all the stuff. He doesn't sleep. So the stresses that he is under, he deals with it in all sorts of ways, but the shortest way is he's got a thick skin from his youth. And he talks in the podcast around a lot of stuff that happened which shaped him as a young man. He won't mind me talking about the story briefly. He talks about, he's got a Japanese mother, and his father went to the Vietnam War, and there was a story that he told about the era of, his mother got treated really poorly after his father died, in a racist sort of way, and he just watched her and how she handled all this horribleness, and watched how she just got on with things and just didn't let it sink in and didn't play the victim and just got on with things. And he said that's what he watched and saw, and that's how he does things. And I think that's the biggest way he does it. He just moves on quickly. He just goes, oh well, nothing's personal, it's just what it is, that's life, go next. So he doesn't hold resentment, he doesn't carry much baggage in terms of that front, and that's a real strength of anybody, I think, to have, and he certainly has it in bags.
Interesting that the thing that he said was the coach has to be like a psychopath a little bit. And that rang true somehow. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so the analogy that he used is a coach has to be like a psychopath in terms of they need to study the room, like they're watching movements between players, relationships, seeing the clicks, seeing who's off, who's on, who needs me to come up to them, who doesn't. And it's that that analysing the way a psychopath might do that is what he sort of mentions is a trait that a coach should have. Obviously without the sort of negative connotations of that, but the same principles as you're trying to pick up cues of human traits. You're trying to look at that side of things and the quicker and better you get at that, as a good psychopath does, you can read really quickly if that person's vulnerable, if that person's in need of something, if that person's someone I shouldn't be going towards. That's the cues right now, like that. And I think it does reign true. And the better you can do that as a coach, the better you're able to smooth over any potential issues before they happen. And he talked about Alex Ferguson. Sorry, mate, I'm getting a little bit. I just had to reference whether he was saying that, or I talked to Steve Hansen as well. But it is Eddie. He said Alex Ferguson, the soccer coach, used to sit with his face to the window watching the car park, watching how his players got out of the car, if they were arguing on the phone, if they were flustered and had a crinkled shirt. He'd be able to say, there's problems at home. I need to make sure that the wife's well. So he'd make sure he asked that player, how's the family life and can we help in any way? And then he made sure at the game he would make sure his wife was well looked after with drinks and a good seat. And that's the kind of extra level of care to make sure that the players are their best versions of themselves.
That's a very interesting point I want to raise. You actually went to Japan with Tony Brown, as coaches for Japan for James Joseph. Am I correct?
Correct.
So number one, Tony Brown. I want to talk to you about that a little bit just now. But you talked about reading the room and reading the body language, but now in Japan, you don't understand the language. The body language is famous for being very closed off, very respectful, hiding things. How do you do that as a coach, not speaking the language, different culture, different backgrounds? How do you do that?
Yes, it's when I first got offered a role in a company team in Japan, NEC. One of my mentors in England who'd been there said, this will be the greatest coaching start point for you, because you're going to learn to do things just by doing it. And you're going to have all these frustrations and things like that. You're going to have to coach without speaking the language. So you're going to have to be simple, clear with your messages, cut back on erroneous things that all coaches tend to say. And you just have to actually refine the way you coach. And that is 100% what happens when you go to Japan. The second element of Japan, which is massive, is the cultural difference. Yes, you can't speak the language, and that's an issue. However, there's layers of 1,000 years of culture in Japan, which is very different to anywhere else in the West. Japan was closed off for the rest of the world for about 300 years, where it got super insular, super Japanese, so no other influence. So that's still, it's still there. It's very much there. And so their way of learning, the way of dealing with things is very different than it is in South Africa, as it is in New Zealand, as it is in England. And a lot of coaches get there, particularly Kiwi coaches, to be fair, and miss the mark on that cultural side, how the education over the last 2,000 years has shaped Japanese players. And often as Kiwis and South Africans can get it wrong too, for different reasons. But Kiwi coaches often come in with this mindset of, just get out there and play what you see. Where's the space? Take it, go for it. That kind of play mentality. However, we're coming in New Zealand from a culture where people grow up with that. And so everyone largely knows those principles and how to play and what to do, and have that mindset of, I'll have a crack, I'll go for it. Yeah, no problem. But in Japan, which is a very hierarchical system where you don't break the rules, you're scared of failure. No one wants to just take the space if it's on, because what if it's the wrong thing? Because in their schooling, they get lambasted for that. So they're a big cultural, it's a big cultural shift to coach in Japan, but it's wonderful for your coaching because you learn so many little tricks and tips all over the show.
Something that we have to talk about is the fact that you were the head coach of Toyota Verblitz, and your director of rugby was Steve Hansen, and he was the second guy you spoke to on the podcast. That's quite a high-profile position for you, number one. And secondly, playing under Steve Hansen, I mean, that guy is famous for stoicism, I would say. He's got no expression on his face ever. I mean, he would probably thrive in Japan. He's got Ian Foster with him as well now. Tell me about Steve Hansen a little bit.
Yeah, look, he's. I really enjoy Steve. I was privileged enough to live next door to him too. Straight shooter, appears gruff and stern and sort of direct, and he is. However, underneath it, he's got a beautiful other side to him. He really cares about people. His leadership and that cultural side he's very open about has morphed dramatically since his early days in Wales and Canterbury. He's maintained his good skill sets, but he's got his leadership down pat, and he's a genuine leader now. And in that podcast, it's full of just great one-liners, just leadership 101 for anyone that wants to be a leader. You just listen to Steve for an hour and you'll come away with pages of notes, because he's very good with that side of things. And that's one of his biggest strengths, his narration around getting the best out of players. And we were lucky to have guys like Willie LaRue and Peter Steff at Toyota with us. And yeah, I know those guys would speak volumes of him as well.
Now, talking about Peter Steff and Willie LaRue, what was your impressions as a coach of those players, coaching them and working with them? What was their work ethic like and their personalities? I know Willie, for example, Jake raves about Willie being a player coach at the Bulls. What were your impressions of them?
Yeah, well, firstly, in terms of professionalism, you wouldn't get better than those two. Just quality. I can see why they've played so long, just because they look after themselves, they train hard, they love the game, they love getting better, they're always trying to grow. That side is without question. Willie is, like Jake says, he's another coach on the field, and that's awesome. That's why I think he gets picked and has kept getting picked into his senior years as a player, because he's like the fourth coach, the coach on the field, and he doesn't stop talking. And that is a skill set in itself, to be able to talk for a whole game, and with good quality chat, good quality communication. He is a guy, and particularly like where he's at now back home, he'll be helping those young players that are coming up to have that as the example of that much talk and that quality communication. That'll take their games to the next level. So he's invaluable as a senior player in any Super Rugby side, and national side for that matter. Peter Steff, well, I think everything that you think he is as a person. Like, he's talk about stoic. You think Steve Hansen's stoic. Peter Steff, just, my goodness, I think he's the toughest man I've ever coached for sure. He just plays through anything, and some of his stories about some of the operations and injuries he's had is beggars belief. Actually, but he's a beautiful man, lovely young family, and yeah, he's a legend of the game. He's class all around.
I want to ask you about the coaching community. We know Steve Hansen and Heineke Meyer, for example, are very good friends. How much is that community, the interconnectedness of the coaches? How much does it mean? How often do they talk to each other, exchange ideas, even if they're playing against each other, not just having a beer, but that growing the culture kind of a thing, not the coaching culture, but the culture among the coaches, being part of this little small elite community?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's good, and certainly I've always loved that side of stuff. So I have pretty good relations with most people in the professional sphere, and hence why we're starting this podcast, because I just having these conversations over beers and get-togethers. I just wanted to put it into sort of a format where it could be saved and preserved over time, and people could get access. I had one person write to me after the first podcast release and just said, I would never have access to a changing room chat like that, and so thanks for doing it. And that was all I needed around this, because I do have access to some of the best coaches in the world who will openly share the ups and downs, and that's. Yeah, you don't always, you hear the ups, but you don't always hear the hard times. And you don't, like Eddie saying, yeah, I didn't get that right there, and that sort of things. And like Steve saying that he burned a few too many people when he shouldn't have, and made that mistake, and it was a lesson for him. That's gold, which in any other media platform you wouldn't get. There's no way that those people would say that sort of stuff to a national broadcaster for TV or radio. So I'm very privileged to be in a position where I can sort of reach into my contacts and some wonderful people. I think different cultures definitely have a different openness to sharing, though. Certainly, where coming from New Zealand, it's a very much a share culture. Leaders like Steve, like Wayne Hansen, like Mike Cron, Steve Hansen, Mike Cron, the best in New Zealand's game are the most open sharers. Graham Henry, they share everything and they're open about it. Their philosophy around it is, as soon as I tell you, it's good because I'll get something back, and also I have to tweak what I'm doing. And there's lots of, and that's kind of the culture of New Zealand. It's a very all for one, share it up, and we go from there. And the more we can get that, and I'd love to help get it in places that are emerging, places like America, Canada. I'd love to get those sort of places just open about sharing, because there's nothing we do which is really that revolutionary on the field. By that, all the technical stuff, everyone's doing largely the same stuff, give or take. But some of the cultural pieces is a little bit different.
Yeah, well, you talked about sharing culture and cultural pieces, and I'm getting to that. You also spoke to some of the South African coaches, well-known people. Johan Ackermann comes to mind, he's one of them. Did you notice a marked difference between the coaches from the different countries? And for example, Johan Ackermann's highly successful coach. What makes him such a successful coach in terms of the balance, technical side, the cultural side? What jumped out for you when you spoke to him?
Johan's a beautiful man. He gets the balance, I think, outstanding. If I had to say where he'd be on a scale, I'd say he'd be 65% culture, 35% technical, tactical. And that's maybe a surprise to people that may just see the exterior and see him as the, that wily old, wasn't he the oldest Springbok at the time, 37 years old, I think he was. And they see that side of him, big man, a little bit gruff and direct with his words. But when you listen to what he says, when you sit down for an hour and say, tell me about what you enjoy and appreciate about rugby, it's all about the people. He even said, when I was chatting to him, the first thing he does in all teams he goes to is run a camp, which most people do, which most pro teams do. But he said, it's all about connecting people. So we do very little rugby. All I want is to speed up the process of people getting to know each other in the team. I want them to know each other's backgrounds. I want them to share their stories. So his whole work in that first camp he does in a team every year is about how he can connect people quickly. So that's where his mindset goes. How do I speed up this process? And he explained it that he wants it to be that once you know a little bit more about something, like if you know that guy's from a single household and didn't have much money and they went through this hardship, then you have a little bit of more empathy and a bit of tightness and togetherness with that person. And that's what is important in rugby, because those are the invisible bits. When it's hard in a game, that guy's been through worse and he's going to be there for me. So if I carry, I know he's going to be with me no matter what, no matter if he's tired, because I know what he's been through in the past. And I think that's awesome. I think the other thing that stood out with Johan, I've talked to the likes of Franz Ludiker, and is in South Africa there is a stronger religious aspect to it, a faith, which I think is a beautiful thing and defines a number of the South African coaches that I've talked to. And for me, it's not so apparent in other cultures such as England, New Zealand, Australia. It's not so prevalent. And what I loved about it when those guys were talking about their faith, they said it was the anchor point for them as a person when they were coaching. So it led them to a way of being as a person which was always consistent and in line with what God would want. And like I think Johan even mentioned, he's doing God's work essentially. He's on God's mission, and he needs to do it in a way which he knows that has been looked down on with favour. And it struck me as a really strong and important thing that's a great anchor point for any coach to have when the pressure comes on, to have someone else that's looking down on you and keeping you accountable to yourself or to the higher power is a really cool concept. And I think conceptually it's something that would be good for all coaches, whether they believe in whatever religion, but just to have that higher accountability, because often in teams the coach is number one with no one higher. But if you have someone higher, and I really found that to be something which was very prevalent with the African coaches.
Yes, that's interesting. Talking about South African coaches, now you haven't spoken to anybody, but you understand South African culture. You've spoken to some South African coaches. You've got experience of coaching overseas. Talking about Tony Brown and Rassie Erasmus. If you ever, I think if there's a culture coach at the moment better than Rassie Erasmus, I would be very surprised. What's your thoughts on Rassie as a coach, both in both those aspects, and then how does Tony Brown fit into this? New Zealand are going to South African setup with the, like I just said, the concepts of higher power and everything. How does that work?
Yeah, well, I'll speak to Tony first because I think South Africa's had the biggest coup in world rugby by getting him.
I agree with you.
He is absolutely brilliant. Like, I just love the way Rassie has done it. He's come up with a formula that works over the last, the last few cycles, and he's done it so well. But he hasn't been happy just to sit and say, like, let's just do that again. He's got, like, each time he's doing something a little bit different, adding this new dynamic, and bringing a guy like Tony in is just perfection, because Tony's attack acumen is second to none. His technical, tactical, and the way he plans and the way he sets up teams is like a chess match. It's beautiful. I've been with it with the Highlanders and Japan, and for me, he's the greatest coach in the world, and he's so understated that he just gets on with it, and he doesn't like to be in front of the media, but he loves it. The other thing about Tony is the changing room love him, because he gets able to put his mind is a maze of stuff, but he's able to simplify it down and put into layman's terms that anyone on the team not only can understand, but can love and buy into and get excited by. That's his real strength. Like, he's a rugby player's coach, because he was a player, and he loved his social side. He loved the boys, loved his team environments, and he brings all that into his coaching. Even though he's a technical and tactical coach, he gets the other side of the game. And you talk to anyone that's been coached under him, you wouldn't have a single person that would say he's anything other than world class. So huge coup on that. In terms of Rassie and what he's done with his cultures, just outstanding. And I think the biggest part of that is he knew exactly what needed to be done. And we talked about where on the spectrum and what you need to hit different teams. I think Rassie's ability is to just go, this is what's needed right now for this team. And he's certainly not a coach that shies away from any of the hard conversations if needed. And he knows South African people, mindset, and the way they want to play. So he can get the right hits. He just goes, this is what we're going to do. We're going to try this. I'm going to play music out in the field for this one. And I'm going to give that guy a serve over here on that one. I'm going to try this crazy system with cones. And it just makes it work. And his personality is pretty true to himself. He is that guy. So it's a real testament to him as a creative coach, I think, with what he's done.
Just lastly, you talked about the way a coach coaches a player, and there has to be a relatability to it. The player mustn't resent the coach for pointing out something to him, and that goes to, is there anything personal? Is there a bit of friction between the two? Does he trust the coach and the likes? Just talk about that side of it. That also is a skill. You have the guy standing there with his whistle and shouting and screaming at everybody, the other guy going and, put his hand around the shoulder. How does that work?
Yeah, there's a lovely phrase. Eddie actually said this phrase, which I think is a gold dust. The art of coaching is coaching without resentment. And what that means is, if you can critique a player on the spot and he doesn't resent that critiquing, then you're going well as a coach. So what that might look like if I said to little Johnny, hey Johnny, you need to go lower when you're carrying that ball into contact. If Johnny goes, got it, yep, and he's excited by that piece of information and he goes, yep, and puts into practice and does it, and there's no ill feeling, then you're obviously doing something right with that connection piece. If I say that, hey Johnny, go a little bit lower into contact, and he sort of goes, and his head goes, whatever, or yeah, no, I was low enough. What's he talking about? If there's that sort of resentment, then there is a missing piece in that relationship, which is going to cause friction, and it's just going to compound and get worse and worse and worse. I did a coaching session on the weekend with Joe Schmidt and watched him coach a group of young boys that he didn't know, and there was a masterclass of how to coach without resentment. He was able to, at one point, he said to a guy, he asked him to demo a drill, and he said exactly that. Mate, you wouldn't carry like that in a game, would you? And then the group around him laughed, and the coaches outside laughed as well. And he goes, yeah, no, I wouldn't. And he did it again and did it really well. But I just reflected on that. That was the skill of someone like Joe Schmidt, that he can say a direct comment like that in such a way that the group like enjoyed it, loved it, and the guy that it was being critiqued didn't feel like he was being ostracized or slammed. And in fact, he enjoyed it as well. And then he went immediately and fixed it straight away. One sentence and an instant fix in front of a group. So that's coaching without resentment. And Joe did that because he gets everything right in his body language, his body tone, his voice, shows no frustration at anything. It's just level and cool.
I'd spend another 6 hours talking to you, and I think we should do this again. Yes, we barely scratched the surface here, but yeah, I think I loved it.
This stuff is so. Here's a cool one which I did. I had this. We did a here in Australia. We did a coaching forum, and Joe Schmidt, Mike Cron. I did a session on culture, and a couple other coaches did some leadership stuff, but there was 250 coaches watching Joe Schmidt run a session. And I did the review of the session for the coaches, because what was really important is everyone was sitting around, the majority of that group was sitting around watching what Joe was coaching technically and tactically. But the point is, he was coaching a young team, like just some 16-year-old boys, and all of the stuff was largely what most coaches would know already. However, what was missed, and this is where I'm really lasering in on at the moment, is I was watching it with a lens of what's he doing culturally during this session. So I wasn't watching the technical and tactical bits, and I didn't miss anything because they're pretty general. But when I was just watching what he was doing, like that example about being able to coach without resentment, that's a cultural piece. The other thing, he'd only met these players for 10 minutes, and he was using all of their names, like putting a name on it. Johnny, you need to be on the red. Timmy on the left, on Johnny on the right. And what that was doing was creating this feeling amongst the group. We're like, oh, like that just the players heard their name. They didn't know how the Australian national coach knew their name particularly, but he just had a system that he would remember, the bulk of people's names. That was why he met them for 10 minutes earlier, is to explain the drills, but also to grab names, to just put them in. So he's got some cultural cues to grab on, actually. So for me, that's where the art of coaching was for him. And everything about him in that same context was his body language just showed to the players how in he was. He didn't raise his tone was always, you could tell he was on it, like fired up, but in a good way. When someone dropped the ball, he didn't go, which sets a little bit of I made a mistake. He was, no problem, this is what we're here, man. Let's roll it again. And he used words like, let's see how good we can be on this drill. And just a statement like that just sets a tone, which is very different from no mistakes, no drop balls on this drill team. Like, that is worlds apart. And he just naturally went to those sort of things. And I just watched the way, every time he blew the whistle and asked for the boys to come in, this group of 30 boys would run in like a pack of wild dogs around a carcass just to hear what he had to say, to lap it up. Because he'd created that connection through the way he did things, the way he interacted, the way he set the mood of the training with the way he was. It was a masterclass in the cultural piece. And I would say 80% of the coaches didn't pick up on any of that because their lens wasn't the importance of culture.
Just, I said it was the last question, but when you talked about Joe Schmidt, the question that popped up in my mind, there's not a lot of certainty about whether he's going to be staying on at Australia because of family reasons, which we're not going to. You yourself had decided to come back from Japan because of family reasons. That's quite an interesting dynamic as well. I mean, you want to be the coach, but it doesn't always work out that way, isn't it?
Yeah, it does. Sometimes the phrase family reasons can mean just something else, and that's the political answer to leave in a good note, which is often the case. But he's got a young family at home in New Zealand, which he's got to be conscious of. But the family dynamic is actually a big thing for coaches in the professional sphere, particularly if you've chased opportunities to move your children around, different schoolings, different languages, all that kind of thing is tough. And in professional rugby, ultimately, you don't know if you're going to be there after the weekend's performance or not. You can be dropped on one game in theory. So it is hard to commit. It's probably harder for the partners. I've been blessed that my wife was open for 10 years to move anywhere. She said to me, look, for the next 10 years, we're going to have children. I'd like to be a stay-at-home mum and do a great job of that. So wherever we go, it doesn't matter. I'm in. And just that's rare. But yeah, it's the other side of professional coaching, which you probably don't see publicly, is that it isn't easy on the family. And particularly when you're not doing well and media's writing stuff about you and the way you do things, and your kids are reading that, and it goes back to school, and they're hearing it from their mates, and it's not always nice. And a lot of coaches that have been sacked from teams say that that's harder on the family than it is on them.
You coach at a school now, Sydney, comprehensive, what is it called?
It's called Newington, which is a fantastic school. So if you know young players that want to come over and get a great Australian upbringing and playing rugby,
yeah,
no, it's a wonderful school. It's a wonderful school.
The reason I'm asking you is just this morning I had a meeting with the guys that we talk about school rugby to in South Africa. And I was thinking about a good idea to speak to them as well. Nico Lees is one of them, Dion de Kock, ex-Springbok. Nico Lees, Coach Tuckies, and he was the Bulls and everything else. We go into school rugby a lot in coaching terms as well, because we speak to all the coaches. And how big school rugby is in South Africa. I'm not sure how big it is in Australia, but I think that should make for an interesting conversation.
Yeah. Well, surprisingly, it's not as big as school boy rugby in South Africa, but it is in the private schools here. Rugby is very competitive and very passionate. So it's a very good level and it's enjoyable.
Okay, I got a bit sidetracked there. So please remember, we're going to put the links down to your channel in the description below, and also in the pinned comment. Coaching Culture by Ben Herring. So that's going to go into you've spoken to Eddie Jones. We're going to publish that. Steve Hansen and the likes. Johan Ackermann's coming up. Make sure you go to his channel. Make sure you subscribe to that channel. It's quite important. Stuff that you wouldn't see normally, that you wouldn't be privy to almost. Fascinating stuff. Thanks, Ben. Appreciate you making time for us.
Thanks, mate. What a pleasure.
This is the Lekker Rugby Interview.